deep in the wilderness where civilization fades into memory and silence becomes a language of its own. Marcus Webb had built a life around one simple truth. He wanted nothing from the world, and the world wanted nothing from him. For 15 years, his isolated cabin had been a fortress against pain, loss, and human connection. The forest, he believed, was empty of everything except the peace he desperately needed. Then a starving, limping stray dog appeared at his doorstep, and everything changed. What Scout dug up beneath an ancient oak tree wasn't just a rusted metal box. Buried for over a century, it was a secret so profound that a man had chosen to hide it rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. Inside were journals, maps, and warnings from 1883, all pointing to something hidden deep within the mountain. Something that had been deliberately sealed away. Something that perhaps was never meant to be found. As Marcus followed the clues deeper into passages carved by hands long turned to dust, he discovered he had a choice to make, one that would define not just his own life, but the fate of a sacred place that had remained undisturbed for generations. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button if you're ready for a tale of mystery, redemption, and secrets buried deep beneath the earth, and stick around until the end, because what Marcus discovers in those caves will leave you questioning what other secrets might be hidden in the wild places of our world. Now, let's begin. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like gossamer veils as Marcus Webb stepped onto the weathered porch of his cabin. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp mountain air, and the familiar creak of the wooden planks beneath his boots was the only sound breaking the profound silence. For 15 years, these mountains had been his sanctuary, his escape from a world that had grown too loud, too fast, too demanding. Marcus had not always been a mountain man. Once he had worn pressed suits and navigated the steel canyons of Chicago, managing accounts and attending meetings that stretched late into fluorescent-lit nights. But after his wife Sarah passed away from cancer, and his daughter chose to stay with her new family on the West Coast, the city had become a mausoleum of memories he could no longer bear to walk through. So he had sold everything, packed what little he needed into an old pickup truck, and driven until the roads turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to trails that only the bold or the broken dared to follow. His cabin sat nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, miles from the nearest town and even farther from what most people called civilization. He had built much of it himself, expanding on the ruins of an old hunting lodge he had purchased for next to nothing. The structure was simple but sturdy: 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a porch that faced east so he could watch the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of amber and gold. Solar panels on the roof provided enough electricity for lights and a small refrigerator, while a nearby stream supplied fresh water year-round. Marcus had convinced himself that he needed nothing more than this. The forest provided everything: firewood, wild game, berries in summer, and the kind of silence that allowed a man to hear his own thoughts without the interference of car horns and television commercials. He had his routines, checking his traps before dawn, tending to his small vegetable garden, reading by lamplight in the evenings. It was a life stripped down to its essential elements, and he had told himself countless times that this was enough, that he had found peace in this isolation. But there were moments, usually in the darkest hours before dawn, when the silence felt less like peace and more like emptiness, when the walls of the cabin seemed to close in rather than protect, when he wondered if he had run away from grief or simply run away from life itself. It was during one of these contemplative periods, on a gray autumn afternoon when the wind carried the first hints of winter, that the dog appeared. Marcus had been splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard a rustling in the underbrush. He reached for the rifle he always kept nearby. Bears and mountain lions were not uncommon in these parts, but instead of a predator, a dog emerged from the tree line. The animal was in rough shape. Its coat was matted and dirty, ribs visible beneath patchy fur that might have once been golden brown. One ear was torn, and it limped on its front left paw. But what struck Marcus most were its eyes: intelligent, watchful, and filled with a wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned. The dog stopped about 20 feet away, neither approaching nor fleeing, simply watching Marcus with an intensity that felt almost human. "You're a long way from anywhere," Marcus said quietly, setting down his axe slowly so as not to spook the animal. "Where did you come from?" The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, but it remained rooted in place, clearly unsure whether this human represented safety or another threat. Marcus had never been particularly fond of pets. Sarah had been the animal lover in the family, but something about this creature's determination to survive moved him. He went inside and returned with some leftover venison from his dinner the night before. He tossed a piece of meat halfway between himself and the dog. The animal watched it land, then looked back at Marcus, as if assessing whether this was a trap. Hunger eventually won over caution, and the dog darted forward, snatched the meat, and retreated to its original position. Marcus repeated the process several times, each throw bringing the meat a little closer to where he stood. By the time the sun was setting, the dog was eating from his hand. Over the next several days, the pattern continued. Marcus would leave food on the porch, and the dog would come to eat, always maintaining a careful distance. Gradually, the animal's appearance improved. Its ribs became less prominent, and its coat began to regain some luster. The limp persisted, but Marcus noticed the dog was putting more weight on the injured paw. More importantly, the wariness in those intelligent eyes began to soften into something that might have been trust. Marcus found himself looking forward to these visits. He began talking to the dog as he went about his chores, narrating his day in a way he hadn't spoken aloud since coming to the mountains. "I'm thinking I need to reinforce the roof before the heavy snows come," he would say while hammering shingles. "What do you think? Will I have enough supplies, or do I need to make a trip into town?" The dog would sit nearby, head tilted, as if actually considering the question. He named the dog Scout, a simple name that seemed to fit the animal's alert, exploratory nature. Scout had a habit of disappearing into the forest for hours at a time, always returning before dark, usually with evidence of successful hunting, blood on his muzzle or the satisfied look of a full belly. Marcus admired the dog's independence, recognizing in Scout a kindred spirit who valued self-reliance but was learning, slowly, to accept companionship. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the peaks with a fury that surprised even Marcus, who had weathered several mountain winters. The temperature plummeted, and snow fell in sheets that transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world of white drifts and ice-laden branches. Scout, who had been sleeping on the porch despite Marcus's attempts to coax him inside, finally accepted the invitation when a blizzard struck with such force that Marcus feared the cabin might blow off its foundation. That night, with the wind howling like a chorus of wolves and the fire crackling in the hearth, Scout curled up on a blanket near the fireplace. Marcus sat in his reading chair, a book open but unread in his lap, watching the dog sleep. Something had shifted, he realized. The cabin no longer felt quite so empty. The silence no longer pressed down with the same oppressive weight. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the stirring of something he had thought long dead. Connection. "I guess you're staying then," he said softly. Scout's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, but the dog didn't open its eyes, content and secure in the warmth of the fire and the presence of the man who had saved him. Marcus had believed the forest held nothing for him except escape and solitude. He had convinced himself that he needed nothing beyond the basic necessities of survival. But as he watched Scout breathe slowly and steadily, he began to wonder if perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps there was still room in his life for trust, for loyalty, for the simple comfort of knowing he was not entirely alone in the world. He couldn't have known then that Scout had brought more than companionship to his isolated existence. The dog had brought a purpose that had been missing, a reason to care about something beyond mere survival. And soon, Scout would lead him to a discovery that would challenge everything. Marcus thought he knew about these mountains and the life he had built within them. The winter passed in a blur of daily routines, punctuated by moments of unexpected contentment. Marcus found himself taking longer walks, exploring parts of the forest he had previously avoided, with Scout ranging ahead, always checking back to ensure his human companion was following. The dog's energy and curiosity were infectious, reminding Marcus of a time when the world had seemed full of possibilities rather than problems. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and coaxing the first green shoots from the thawing earth, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not for anything specific, but simply for what each new day might bring. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten, one that made him realize just how deeply he had buried himself in routine and resignation. He should have recognized it as a premonition. The first signs of Scout's unusual behavior began on a morning in late April when the forest was alive with the sounds of returning songbirds and the rush of snowmelt swelling the streams. Marcus was repairing a section of fence around his garden when Scout, who had been napping in a patch of sunlight, suddenly stood and began to pace restlessly. The dog's demeanor had changed in an instant. His ears were pricked forward, his tail held stiff, and his entire body radiated an intensity that Marcus had never seen before. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked, setting down his tools. "Here's something." Scout barked once, a sharp, insistent sound, then trotted toward the tree line on the western edge of the clearing. He stopped and looked back at Marcus, barked again, then continued into the forest. Marcus hesitated. The western section was an area he rarely visited, as the terrain was rough and dense with undergrowth, but Scout's behavior was so unusual that Marcus felt compelled to follow. He grabbed his pack, rifle, and a walking stick before setting off after the dog. Scout moved with purpose, following no visible trail but navigating the forest with the confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. They walked for over an hour, climbing steadily upward as the forest grew older and darker. The trees here, ancient sentinels that blocked out most of the sunlight. Marcus had to scramble over fallen logs and push through thorny bushes that caught at his clothes, but Scout never slowed. Finally, they emerged into a small hollow that Marcus was certain he had never seen before. It was an odd place, sheltered on three sides by moss-covered rocks and dominated by a massive old oak tree whose gnarled roots spread across the ground like arthritic fingers. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on Marcus's arms stand up. Scout had stopped near the base of the oak and was digging furiously, his paws sending up sprays of dark earth. "Hey, stop that," Marcus called out, worried the dog might injure his previously hurt paw. But Scout ignored him. digging with an intensity that bordered on frantic. Marcus approached and knelt beside the dog, intending to pull him away, when he saw something that made him freeze. In the hole Scout had excavated, something was reflecting the dappled sunlight that filtered through the oak's canopy. Marcus pushed the dog gently aside and brushed away more dirt with his hands. His fingers touched metal cold, smooth, and clearly manufactured. His heart began to beat faster as he cleared more earth away, revealing what appeared to be a metal box, approximately 2 feet long and a foot wide, with a curved top like a small trunk. It took Marcus another 20 minutes of careful digging to free the box from the earth. It was heavier than he expected, and covered in a layer of corrosion and dirt that suggested it had been buried for a long time. There was a lock on the front, rusted but still intact. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. How had Scout known this was here? And more importantly, what was in it? The rational part of his brain urged caution. This could be anything: someone's hidden savings, stolen goods, or worse. But curiosity, that uniquely human trait that had been dormant in Marcus for so long, had been awakened. He carefully wrapped the box in his jacket, secured it to his pack, and began the trek back to the cabin, with Scout trotting contentedly beside him, as if satisfied with a job well done. Back at the cabin, Marcus set the box on his workbench and studied it under better light. The metal was steel or iron, with decorative etchings along the edges that were barely visible beneath the rust. The lock was old-fashioned but solid. Marcus considered forcing it, but decided against damaging whatever might be inside. Instead, he retrieved his toolkit and spent the next hour carefully working on the lock mechanism with various picks and lubricants. His hands, more accustomed to rough work, surprised him with their steadiness as he manipulated the corroded tumblers. Finally, with a click that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin, the lock opened. Marcus paused, suddenly nervous. Whatever was in this box had been important enough for someone to bury it in an isolated location and seal it away. He took a breath and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had partially disintegrated, were papers. Lots of them. Marcus carefully lifted the first packet and gently unfolded it. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible, a precise, educated hand that spoke of a different era. As Marcus began to read, he felt the past reaching across the years to tell him a story he never expected to hear. The documents were a diary, written by a man named Thomas Blackwood, dated between 1876 and 1883. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks or months apart, and told the tale of a geological surveyor who had come to these mountains to map mineral deposits for a mining company. But Thomas Blackwood had found something far more significant than copper or silver. Marcus read late into the night, forgetting to eat, barely noticing when Scout nuzzled his leg for attention. Blackwood's entries described the discovery of what he called ancient earthworks structures, built into the mountainside that predated any known habitation of the area. He wrote of tunnels that descended into the mountain, of chambers carved from living rock, and of symbols and artwork that suggested a sophisticated culture had once thrived here. But that wasn't all. Blackwood had made detailed surveys and maps of these structures, noting that some of the tunnels appeared to lead to natural caves that connected to a vast underground system. He theorized that the indigenous peoples of the region had used these caves for ceremonial purposes, or possibly as refuge during harsh winters. His writing conveyed both scientific excitement and a growing sense of unease. The later entries hinted at something darker: warnings from local Native Americans to leave the mountain alone, strange sounds emanating from deep within the caves, and an increasing fear that he had stumbled upon something that was meant to remain hidden. The final entry, dated September 14, 1883, was brief and troubling. "I have decided to seal my records here, where they will be safe from those who would exploit this sacred place. The company men grow impatient with my lack of mineral findings and suspect I am hiding something of value. They are not entirely wrong, though what I have found cannot be measured in gold or silver. Tonight, I will return one last time to close off the main entrance as best I can. If you are reading this, I pray you possess the wisdom to decide whether this knowledge should see the light of day, or whether some secrets are better left buried. T.B." Marcus set down the papers, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Scout, who was lying by the fire, watching him with those intelligent eyes. "What have you gotten us into, boy?" The implications were staggering. If Blackwood's account was accurate, there were significant archaeological remains somewhere on this mountain, remains that could rewrite the history of the region. But why had Blackwood sealed his findings away? And what had happened to him after that final entry? Marcus spent the next several days examining the rest of the box's contents. There were detailed maps, drawn with the precision of a trained surveyor, showing locations marked with cryptic notations. There were sketches of symbols that looked vaguely familiar to Marcus from museum visits in his previous life, geometric patterns, and stylized animals that spoke of a sophisticated artistic tradition. And there were photographs, their surfaces cracked and faded, showing the entrance to what appeared to be a cave, though the quality was too poor to make out much detail. One document in particular caught Marcus's attention: a letter from the mining company to Blackwood, dated August 1883, demanding that he produce results or face termination and legal action for breach of contract. The tone was threatening, suggesting that the company suspected Blackwood of finding valuable deposits and keeping the information for himself. Reading between the lines, Marcus began to form a theory about what might have happened to Thomas Blackwood. The ethical dilemma weighed heavily on Marcus. His mountains were on federal land, technically part of a national forest. Any significant archaeological finds should be reported to the proper authorities. But Blackwood's warnings echoed in his mind. What if revealing this information led to the kind of exploitation and destruction that the surveyor had feared? What if tourists and treasure hunters descended on these pristine mountains, tearing them apart in search of artifacts and glory? Marcus had come to these mountains seeking escape, wanting nothing more than to be left alone. Now, he held information that could change everything, not just for him, but for the mountain itself. Scout had dug up more than a buried box. He had unearthed a responsibility that Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to bear. For 3 days, Marcus debated with himself. He would decide to report the find, then talk himself out of it. He would resolve to rebury the box and forget he had ever seen it, then find himself unable to ignore what he had learned. The internal conflict was exhausting, reminding him of the stress and anxiety he had fled when he left Chicago. On the 4th morning, Marcus made his decision. He would investigate further. He would try to locate the structures Blackwood had described, assess their condition and significance, and then determine the best course of action. It was a compromise between his desire to respect Blackwood's wishes and his growing sense that this knowledge was too important to ignore. He spent the rest of the day preparing for an expedition, packing supplies, studying Blackwood's maps, and trying to correlate the surveyor's landmarks with the modern landscape. Some things would have changed in nearly 150 years. Trees would have grown and fallen. Streams might have altered their courses, and landmarks could have been obscured by landslides or erosion. But the basic geography of the mountains would remain the same, and Blackwood's maps were detailed enough that Marcus felt confident he could at least find the general area described in the journals. Scout seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. The dog stayed close to Marcus as he worked, occasionally whining softly as if expressing concern or excitement. Marcus paused in his preparations to kneel beside Scout and scratch behind the dog's ears. "You started this. You know," he said softly. "If it weren't for you, that box would still be buried, and I'd still be living my simple, uncomplicated life. I'm not sure whether to thank you or curse you." Scout licked his hand, and Marcus laughed despite his anxiety. Whatever lay ahead, at least he wouldn't be facing it alone. As the sun set that evening, Marcus stood on his porch and looked out at the darkening forest. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath centuries of soil and vegetation, lay the remnants of a forgotten people and the mysteries they had left behind. Thomas Blackwood had found those mysteries and chosen to protect them. Now, that choice had been passed to Marcus, whether he wanted it or not. He thought about Sarah and how she would have loved this adventure. She had always been the brave one, the one who pushed him to take risks and embrace uncertainty. "Life is too short to play it safe," she used to say. Marcus had forgotten that lesson in his grief, retreating to these mountains where nothing could hurt him because nothing could reach him. But Scout had reached him, and through Scout, the past had reached him. And now, standing on the threshold of a mystery that had waited nearly a century and a half to be rediscovered, Marcus Webb felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. He felt alive. Tomorrow, the real adventure would begin. The morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost prophetic. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the air carried the crisp freshness of spring that made everything feel possible. Marcus loaded his pack with supplies for a multi-day expedition: food, water purification, tablets, rope, flashlights, first aid kit, and Blackwood's maps carefully sealed in waterproof bags. He also packed a camera, realizing that whatever he found would need to be documented. Scout was waiting by the door, practically vibrating with eagerness. The dog had been restless all night, as if he too understood that something important was about to happen. Marcus checked his gear one more time, locked the cabin, and set out into the forest with Scout leading the way. They followed Blackwood's maps westward and upward, into terrain that grew increasingly rugged. Marcus found himself relying on landmarks that the surveyor had noted: an oddly shaped rock formation that resembled a sitting bear, a lightning-struck pine that had somehow survived and continued growing despite its scarred trunk, a stream that split around a massive boulder before rejoining downstream. Each confirmed landmark bolstered Marcus's confidence that he was on the right path. By afternoon, they had climbed high enough that the air had thinned noticeably, and Marcus could see across the valley to the next range of peaks. According to Blackwood's notes, they were close. The surveyor had described a cliff face with a distinctive overhang, beneath which the entrance to the cave system could be found. Marcus scanned the area ahead and spotted what he was looking for: a rocky escarpment with vegetation growing down from its top like a green waterfall. They reached the cliff face just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Up close, the overhang was more impressive than Marcus had anticipated, creating a natural shelter about 30 feet deep and 20 feet high. But there was no obvious cave entrance. Marcus consulted the maps again, then began examining the cliff face more carefully. That's when he noticed it. What appeared to be a natural fold in the rock was actually too regular, too deliberate. Someone had piled stones to create a wall that blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding cliff. Over the decades, vegetation had grown over and between the stones, further obscuring the artificial nature of the barrier. This must be the entrance Blackwood had mentioned sealing in his final journal entry. Marcus set up camp under the overhang, deciding to wait until morning to attempt opening the entrance. He needed good light for what came next, and the truth was, he was nervous. There was still time to turn back, to forget what he had found and return to his simple life. But as he sat by his small camp stove, eating a simple dinner of rehydrated soup and watching Scout gnaw contentedly on a stick, Marcus knew he was past the point of no return. The mystery had taken hold of him, awakening a part of himself that had been dormant for too long. That night, he dreamed of Thomas Blackwood, a tall man with a surveyor's transit on his shoulder, standing at the entrance to the cave and beckoning Marcus forward. In the dream, Marcus tried to speak, to ask what he should do, but no sound came from his mouth. Blackwood simply smiled sadly and pointed into the darkness of the cave before fading away like morning mist. Marcus woke before dawn, groggy but filled with a sense of purpose. He made coffee over his camp stove and watched the sunrise paint the cliff face in shades of orange and gold. When there was enough light to work by, he approached the sealed entrance and began the painstaking process of removing stones. They were heavier than they looked, some requiring all his strength to shift. Scout helped in his own way, digging at the base of the wall where smaller rocks had settled. After 3 hours of hard labor, Marcus had created an opening large enough to squeeze through. He retrieved a powerful LED flashlight from his pack and shone it into the gap. The beam revealed a passage that descended into the mountain at a gentle angle, the walls showing clear evidence of human modification to straight and regular to be entirely natural. Ancient chisel marks were still visible on some surfaces, and the ceiling had been smoothed to a consistent height of about 7 feet. Marcus's heart was pounding as he prepared to enter. He tied a rope to a sturdy rock outside and fed it through his belt, a safety line that would help him find his way back if he got disoriented. He had already decided that Scout would have to wait outside. He couldn't risk the dog getting lost or injured in unknown passages. But when he gave the command for Scout to stay, the dog looked at him with such distress that Marcus relented, attaching a leash to the dog's collar. "Okay, but you stay close," Marcus said firmly. Scout's tail wagged once in acknowledgement. Taking a deep breath, Marcus Webb squeezed through the opening and entered the mountain. The passage was cool and smelled of damp earth and ancient stone. Marcus's flashlight beam revealed that the tunnel extended ahead for perhaps 50 feet before opening into what appeared to be a larger chamber. The walls were decorated with carvings, not the primitive scratches he might have expected, but sophisticated artwork depicting animals, celestial bodies, and human figures engaged in what looked like ceremonial activities. Marcus ran his fingers over the carvings, marveling at the skill required to create such detail with primitive tools. The first chamber took his breath away. It was a natural cave that had been extensively modified, roughly circular and about 40 feet in diameter. The ceiling rose to a natural dome, perhaps 20 feet high, and someone had carved channels in the rock that would have directed smoke from fires toward a natural chimney. Around the walls were alcoves, each containing artifacts, stone tools, pottery fragments, and items that Marcus couldn't immediately identify. In the center of the chamber was a fire pit, surrounded by stones arranged in a precise circle. But what captured Marcus's attention was the wall opposite the entrance. It was covered in pictographs, ancient paintings that had been protected from the elements and remained remarkably vivid. The images told a story, people living in harmony with the mountains, hunting, gathering, raising families, and then something changed. The paintings showed people entering the mountain, depicted by spirals leading downward. Some emerged, but others didn't. The later images showed conflict, fear, and ultimately, the people leaving, the cave sealed behind them. Marcus photographed everything methodically, aware that he was documenting something that hadn't been seen by human eyes in centuries. Scout stayed close, unusually quiet, as if sensing the sacred nature of this place. From this main chamber, 3 passages led deeper into the mountain. Marcus chose the largest, following it downward. The passage wound through the rock like a serpent, sometimes narrowing to the point where Marcus had to turn sideways to squeeze through, sometimes opening into smaller chambers. In one such chamber, he found something that made him stop in his tracks: human remains. The skeleton was ancient, lying in what appeared to be a deliberate burial position, hands folded across the chest. Around it were grave goods, a beautifully crafted stone knife, beads made from shells that must have come from hundreds of miles away, and a clay pot that was miraculously intact. Marcus stood respectfully, acutely aware that he was intruding on someone's final resting place. He took only a few photos, feeling that some things should remain private even in death. As he ventured deeper, Marcus began to understand why Blackwood had been so disturbed. There was something about these caves that affected the senses. Sounds behaved oddly, echoing in unexpected ways. Shadows seemed to move independently of his flashlight beam. Several times Marcus could have sworn he heard voices, whispers that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. He told himself it was just wind flowing through the complex cave system, but a more primitive part of his brain wasn't convinced. Scout began to whine, pulling back on the leash, clearly wanting to return to the surface. Marcus was about to honor the dog's instincts when his flashlight beam caught something ahead that made him pause. The passage opened into another chamber, and on the far wall was a painting unlike anything he had seen before. It showed the mountain itself, rendered with topographical precision that spoke of detailed knowledge of the landscape. But beneath the mountain, the artist had painted something else, a vast space, a cavern of enormous proportions, rendered in swirling colors that suggested both beauty and danger. At the center of this underground space was a pool of water, painted in shimmering blues and greens, and above it, figures that might have been human but seemed to possess an otherworldly quality. Beneath the painting were symbols that Marcus recognized from Blackwood's sketches, warnings perhaps, or instructions. Without any way to translate them, Marcus could only guess at their meaning. But the emotion conveyed by the artwork was clear: awe, reverence, and fear. Marcus realized with a start that he had been underground for hours. His flashlight was beginning to dim, and Scout's distress was increasing. It was time to return to the surface. As he made his way back through the passages, following his safety rope, Marcus's mind was reeling. What he had found was beyond anything he had imagined, an extensive archaeological site that could provide insights into a culture that had thrived here long before recorded history. But Blackwood's warnings echoed in his thoughts. The surveyor had seen something that convinced him this place should remain hidden, and Marcus had felt it too, that sense of trespass, of entering a space that had been deliberately sealed, not just to protect the artifacts inside, but perhaps to protect the outside world from something within. When they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, both Marcus and Scout seemed to breathe easier. The modern world, with its logical explanations and scientific certainties, felt like a refuge after the otherworldly atmosphere of the caves. Marcus sealed the entrance partially, leaving it accessible but not obvious to casual observers, and returned to his campsite to think. That evening, as he sat by his fire with Scout's warm weight pressed against his leg, Marcus faced the decision he had been avoiding. What should he do with what he had discovered? The archaeologist in him, a part he hadn't known existed, wanted to bring in experts to properly study and preserve this incredible find. But the guardian in him, the part that had learned to respect the mountain's mysteries, hesitated. He thought about Thomas Blackwood, who had faced the same choice nearly 150 years ago and had decided to bury his findings. But Blackwood had lived in a different time, when the sacred places of indigenous peoples were routinely destroyed in the name of progress and profit. The world was different now. There were laws protecting archaeological sites, tribes who could reclaim their heritage, scholars who would treat these artifacts with respect. And yet, Marcus had seen enough of human nature to know that even the best intentions could lead to exploitation. Once the site was known, it would be studied, visited, analyzed, and ultimately changed by the very act of observation. The cave paintings that had remained pristine for centuries would deteriorate from exposure to modern air and bacteria. The burial sites would be excavated, the remains catalogued and stored in museums. The mystery and magic of the place would be dissected and explained until nothing remained but dry facts in academic journals. Marcus spent 3 more days exploring the caves, venturing farther each time, documenting everything he found. He discovered a total of 11 chambers, some natural, some clearly modified, all containing evidence of long-term habitation. The artifacts suggested a culture that had been sophisticated and spiritually complex, one that had understood the mountain in ways that modern people had forgotten. On the final day of his exploration, Marcus found what he believed was the source of Blackwood's greatest unease. Following the largest passage to its deepest point, he emerged into a cavern so vast that his flashlight couldn't reach the far walls. The sound of water echoed through the space, and when Marcus followed it, he found an underground lake. Its surface so still and dark that it looked like a pool of liquid night. The cavern was breathtaking in its immensity. Stalactites hung from the invisible ceiling like the teeth of some primordial beast, and the walls where his light could reach them were covered in mineral deposits that sparkled like stars. The underground lake stretched out before him, and Marcus estimated it to be at least 100 feet across, possibly much larger. The water was so clear that when he shone his light downward, he could see straight to the bottom, perhaps 20 feet down, where pale stone formations created an alien landscape. Standing at the edge of that lake, Marcus felt a presence not threatening but ancient and aware. He couldn't explain it rationally, couldn't point to any evidence, but he knew with absolute certainty that this place was still important to someone or something. Whether it was the spirits that the indigenous peoples had believed in, or simply the weight of centuries of accumulated respect and reverence, Marcus felt he was being watched, judged, and found to be tolerable. He sat down on a smooth boulder near the water's edge, Scout settling beside him with unusual quietness. They remained there for perhaps an hour, Marcus lost in thought while the dog seemed content simply to be present. In that profound silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the darkness, Marcus found himself thinking about the trajectory of his life. He had spent so many years running from pain, from connection, from responsibility. He had convinced himself that isolation was strength, that needing nothing from anyone was a form of freedom. But sitting in this ancient place, Marcus understood that he had been wrong. True strength wasn't in isolation. It was in choosing what to protect, what to preserve, what to stand for. Freedom wasn't the absence of responsibility. It was the ability to choose which responsibilities to embrace. He thought about the modern world he had left behind, a world that measured value in economic terms, that saw every mountain as a potential mine, every forest as potential lumber, every secret as something to be exploited for profit or fame. He imagined what would happen if he revealed this place. The news coverage, the influx of archaeologists and tourists, the infrastructure that would be built to accommodate them. The caves would be illuminated with electric lights, equipped with handrails and guided tours. The artifacts would be removed to climate-controlled museums. The pictographs would be photographed and analyzed until every mystery had been solved and catalogued, and something precious would be lost, not just the physical integrity of the site, but something more intangible, the sense of the sacred, the mystery that allowed people to imagine, to wonder, to stand in awe of something larger than themselves. In making the caves accessible to everyone, they would become special to no one. He made his decision in that moment, standing in the darkness beside an underground lake that no modern eyes had seen. He would not report the caves. Not yet, maybe not ever. Instead, he would become what Thomas Blackwood had tried to be, a guardian. He would keep the secret, protect the site, and ensure that it remained undisturbed. If circumstances changed, if he became convinced that revealing the site would serve a greater good, he could always reconsider. But until then, the caves would keep their secrets. "What do you think, Scout?" he asked softly, his voice barely disturbing the stillness. "Am I making the right choice?" Scout looked up at him, and in the dim reflection of the flashlight, Marcus could have sworn the dog understood the gravity of the question. The animal pressed closer against his leg, offering the only answer that mattered. "You are not alone in this decision." Marcus reached down and stroked Scout's head, feeling a surge of gratitude for this animal who had wandered into his life and changed everything. "All right then," he said. "We're guardians now, you and me. Let's go home." The hike back to the cabin took most of a day, and Marcus arrived exhausted but strangely at peace. He had come to the mountains seeking isolation and escape, wanting nothing from the world and believing the world had nothing to offer him. Scout had changed that. First by offering companionship, then by leading him to a mystery that had rekindled his sense of purpose. In the weeks that followed, Marcus settled back into his routines, but with a new awareness. He was no longer just a man hiding from life. He was a guardian of something important, a keeper of secrets that connected past and present. He continued to visit the caves periodically, checking to ensure they remained undisturbed, occasionally making new discoveries in passages he hadn't fully explored. He also began to research the indigenous peoples of the region, reading everything he could find about their history, culture, and beliefs. He learned that the area had been sacred to several tribes, a place of vision quests and spiritual renewal. The caves matched descriptions and oral histories of a place where the spirits of the mountain dwelled, a place that was both dangerous and holy. Marcus began to understand that what he had found wasn't just an archaeological site, it was a cathedral, a place where humans had come to touch something greater than themselves. The seasons turned, and Marcus found himself marking time not by calendar dates but by the rhythms of the mountain. He learned which medicinal plants grew where, which streams ran year-round and which dried up in summer, where the deer bedded down in winter and where the bears denned. Scout remained his constant companion, growing stronger and healthier with each passing month, the limp finally disappearing entirely. Marcus also began keeping a journal, following in Blackwood's footsteps. He documented his visits to the caves with meticulous detail, photographing and sketching everything he found, but always careful to leave no trace of his presence. He recorded the changing seasons inside the caves, noting how temperature and humidity fluctuated, how water levels in the underground lake rose and fell. He became an amateur archaeologist, teaching himself proper documentation techniques through books ordered from distant libraries. But more than that, he wrote about what he felt: the responsibility, the wonder, the occasional doubt about whether he had made the right choice. "Sometimes I think I'm being selfish," he wrote one evening by lamplight. "Who am I to decide that the world shouldn't know about this place? But then I visit the caves again, and I feel that presence, that sense of something sacred still inhabiting those spaces, and I know that some things are worth protecting even from good intentions." He also began preparing for the future, for the day when he would no longer be able to fulfill his role as guardian. He created detailed maps and instructions, sealed them in waterproof containers, and decided that when the time came, he would entrust them to the indigenous peoples whose ancestors had created the caves. They, more than anyone, had the right to decide the site's fate. During this time, Marcus's relationship with Scout deepened in ways that surprised him. The dog seemed to understand the importance of their shared secret, becoming almost protective of the route to the caves. On their regular visits, Scout would range ahead, checking for any signs that others had been in the area, and would alert Marcus to anything unusual. It was as if the dog had appointed himself co-guardian, taking the responsibility as seriously as Marcus did. One autumn evening, nearly a year after Scout had first dug up Blackwood's box, Marcus received unexpected visitors. 2 hikers had gotten lost and stumbled upon his cabin just as a storm was rolling in. Marcus, who had avoided human contact for so long, found himself welcoming them, offering hot coffee and shelter from the rain. As they sat around his fireplace, the younger of the 2 hikers, a college student named Emily, noticed the books on indigenous cultures scattered around the cabin. "Are you an anthropologist?" she asked with genuine curiosity. Marcus smiled. "No, just an interested amateur. These mountains have a fascinating history." They talked late into the night, and Marcus found himself enjoying the conversation more than he would have expected. Emily was studying archaeology, and her enthusiasm reminded Marcus of what he had once felt about his own work. Before corporate life had drained the passion from him, he was careful not to reveal anything about the caves, but he shared what he had learned about the region's indigenous peoples, their beliefs, and their reverence for the mountains. When the hikers left the next morning, Emily thanked Marcus profusely. "You've inspired me," she said. "Sometimes I forget why I got into archaeology. It becomes all about grants and publications and academic politics. But talking to you reminded me that it's really about respecting and preserving the stories of the past." After they left, Marcus sat on his porch with Scout and thought about that conversation. Perhaps, he reflected, his guardianship wasn't just about keeping the caves secret. It was also about keeping alive the spirit of respect and reverence that had motivated people like Blackwood, and that inspired young scholars like Emily. The caves themselves were important, but so was the attitude toward sacred spaces that they represented. Winter came again, the second since Scout had entered Marcus's life, and it was harsher than the first. The snow piled high, and there were days when Marcus couldn't leave the cabin at all. During these long, dark evenings, he read and reread Blackwood's journals, finding new meanings in passages he had glossed over before. He came to feel a kinship with the long-dead surveyor, understanding the loneliness of bearing important knowledge that couldn't be shared, the weight of responsibility that no one else could appreciate. But Marcus also realized that he was happier than he had been in years, perhaps happier than he had been since Sarah's death. The responsibility he carried, rather than being a burden, had given his life structure and meaning. He had a purpose that got him up in the morning, that made him pay attention to the world around him, that connected him to something larger than his own small existence. One evening, nearly 6 months after Scout had dug up Blackwood's box, Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in colors that defied description. Scout lay beside him, gray now appearing around the dog's muzzle, a reminder that time moved forward, whether we acknowledged it or not. Marcus thought about Sarah, and for the first time in years, the memory didn't bring crushing sadness. Instead, he felt gratitude for the time they had shared, and a strange sense that she would have approved of the choice he had made. "You were right," he said softly, speaking to his absent wife as if she could hear him. "Life is too short to play it safe. But it's also too short to let important things be destroyed just because we're too lazy or scared to protect them." Scout's tail thumped against the porch boards, and Marcus smiled, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Tomorrow, he would make another trip to the caves, continuing his self-appointed mission to document and protect them. But tonight, he was content to sit here, watching the day surrender tonight, knowing that he had found something worth living for. The mountain held its secrets still, hidden in passages that wound through ancient stone, guarded by the shade of a long-dead surveyor and a solitary mountain man who had learned that sometimes the greatest discoveries are the ones we choose not to share. And somewhere in those dark passages, perhaps the spirits that had once called these caves home looked on approvingly, knowing that at least 2 humans separated by nearly 150 years but united in purpose had understood what truly mattered. Scout had dug up a box, yes, but what he had really unearthed was Marcus Webb's connection to something larger than himself, a reason to engage with the world rather than hide from it. The forest had held nothing, Marcus had believed, but he had been wrong. It had held everything: mystery, purpose, and the possibility of redemption. It had just been waiting for the right moment, and the right dog, to reveal itself. As darkness settled fully over the mountains and the first stars appeared in the crystalline sky, Marcus made a silent promise to the mountain, to Blackwood, and to himself. He would be worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. The caves would remain safe, their stories preserved for a future generation that might be wiser, more respectful, more deserving of their secrets. Until then, they were his responsibility, his burden, and his gift, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Years later, hikers would occasionally report seeing an old man and an aging dog moving through the forest with the confidence of those who knew every tree and stone. Some claimed the man kept detailed journals filled with sketches and observations, though no one ever saw them up close. Local rangers noted that certain areas of the mountains seemed unusually well maintained, fallen trees cleared from trails that weren't on any official map, markers that appeared to warn away from unstable ground. signs of careful stewardship in places where no one should have been. When Marcus Webb finally passed away at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep with Scout's successor, a young shepherd mix he'd named Spirit, lying beside his bed, the authorities found his cabin meticulously organized. His will left the property to a coalition of indigenous tribes native to the region, with a letter attached that simply read, "There are some things I wish to show you. Follow the maps, respect what you find, and make the decision I could not. The mountain will guide you." Among his possessions, they found Blackwood's original box, along with decades' worth of Marcus's own journals, photographs, and carefully drawn maps. But they also found a second letter, this one addressed to whoever comes after. In it, Marcus had written, "I was a man who believed he wanted nothing, needed nothing, and had nothing left to give. A stray dog proved me wrong on all counts. What Scout led me to was not just an archaeological treasure, but a reminder that we are all guardians of something whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is not whether we will leave a mark on the world, but what kind of mark it will be. I chose to leave this place unmarked, unspoiled, and undisturbed. But I leave the choice to you, and I trust you will make it with wisdom, respect, and love for the mysteries that make life worth living. Some secrets are meant to be kept, others are meant to be shared. I pray you will know the difference." The tribal elders, upon exploring the caves Marcus had protected for so long, wept at what they found their heritage, preserved and honored by a stranger who had understood what many of their own people had forgotten. They made the decision Marcus had anticipated. The caves would remain sealed, known only to a select few, visited only for ceremonial purposes, and protected by law and tradition for generations to come. A small plaque was placed at the entrance to Marcus's property, visible only to those who knew to look for it. It read simply, "Here lived Marcus Webb, guardian of secrets, friend to lost dogs, and keeper of promises. The mountain remembers." And perhaps it does. Perhaps in the wind that whispers through the pines, in the cool darkness of ancient caves, in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and a trust well kept, the mountain does remember. It remembers Thomas Blackwood, who chose wisdom over profit. It remembers Marcus Webb, who chose purpose over isolation. And it remembers Scout, the stray dog who brought them together across the years. Some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear a dog barking in those mountains, leading the way to mysteries that remain hidden, waiting for the rare soul brave enough to follow, and wise enough to know when to turn back. But that might just be the wind. Then again, it might not.